Professor Yasha Monk, first, thank you for talking to Liberal magazine. So your new book, The Great Experiment, is a very optimistic book. And in Israel and also around the world, liberal people are quite pessimistic. So I wonder, can you explain us why you are optimistic about democracy and multicultural democracy in the age of populism?
My book before that was about the serious threat that populist movements pose to liberal democracies. And that threat remains with us. We see it in many countries today, from Hungary to India. And even in countries where populists were recently defeated, including Brazil and the United States, these figures continue to have a lot of power. The second reason why it's qualified optimism is that deep ethnic and religious diversity pose very real challenges, which are chronicled in the book. There's deep reasons why it isn't easy to sustain democracies when they are so diverse. Nevertheless, I think there are some reasons for relative optimism around the world at the moment. The first is that democratic countries have proven somewhat more resilient to autocratic attack than they might have been in the last years. The fact that both in Brazil and the United States, autocratic leaders have been, would-be autocratic leaders have been thrown out of office after the first term in government is, I think, very significant. And the second is that, in this book, I really think about this challenge, the problem of diversity and how to deal with it. And I think actually that many countries, many democracies around the world are doing much better at that than most people believe. That just away from politics, away from the headline news, we're doing much better at sustaining ethnic and religiously diverse societies that actually have some form of common identity than we might have expected. And by the way, people are making great socioeconomic progress, great educational progress. And so I think the possibility that this great experiment succeed are rather higher than people tend to acknowledge.
You suggest in the book, create the multicultural democracies. We have to break boundaries between Republicans and Democrats and try to not only fight or demonize the other political party, but I think there is maybe a mechanism that there is immigration and people are afraid, and some of them support, you call it soft domination or hard domination of the minorities, and then the minorities have some justification to not talk to these people. Like, I really understand a minority that says, I can't talk to someone who supports deportation or aggressive violence of the states against me. So it's like, it's a mechanism that creates itself, and I ask, how can we fight it, or what can we do to break it?
Yeah, so in highly polarized societies, you do get these clashes between different demographic groups. Once it really structures politics, it becomes very dangerous. Once your fundamental rights and obligations as an individual citizen are determined by which group you are part of, it effectively becomes hard to have some form of shared identity at the same time. This is a danger that I see in some countries, and I think Israel is among them. But in most diverse democracies, the demographic, knowing somebody's race or ethnicity today tells you much less about who they're going to vote for than it did even 10 years ago. I think in Israel, both because of the starkness of the divide between Jewish Israelis and non-Jewish Israelis, and because of the depth of the divide between ultra-Orthodox religious people and secular society, it is harder to have those grounds of common identity. But I think the goal of Israel needs to be to sustain, not perhaps a very thick, but some kind of minimal sense of common identity that can keep the society together. And by the way, that doesn't mean that you have to love or embrace each other. With Democrats and Republicans, it's not that Democrats should like Republicans and Republicans should like Democrats, but it has to be enough so that you say we can share a country together, and we're going to prioritize finding a way to share this country over political victory.
So last question is about, I think, an important idea in your book. You argue that demographic determinism is wrong, that you can't look on the gross population of every ethnical group and to predict what the elections result in 20 years will be. And in Israel, everyone is talking about demographic determinism because they say ultra-Orthodox and Palestinians are getting bigger and maybe they will not be minorities in the future, and this will shape the politics of the future. So I want to ask you if you think that demographic determinism is wrong in every situation, or maybe if some ethnical groups are more strict than other groups, so it has some logical argument.
If you have a society that has a long history of integrating immigrants, of shifting divides, of who is part of the in-group and who is not, or who can belong to the mainstream, then demographic predictions become very powerless. Obviously, in places where you have much more long-standing demographic blocks and ones that are in much more open enmity with each other, as is the case, for example, between Jews and Palestinians, it's more likely that they will continue to have tension with each other. I don't think that I think the boundary line between who's Latino and who's white may well blur or even disappear over time. I don't think that the boundary line between Jews, Israelis and Palestinians is going to disappear anytime soon. I think it would be naive to say that. Having said that, many confident predictions demographically turn out to be wrong. I understand that some prominent Israeli demographers predicted in the mid-1980s that by about the year 2000, non-Jewish citizens of Israel would be in a majority because of divergent birth rates. As it turns out, because of higher levels of education, economic opportunity and access to medical care, the birth rate among non-Jewish citizens of Israel dropped, and they continue to be in a distinct minority. So in those kinds of ways, I do think that demography tells us something about the future, but we must avoid the temptation to project current trends forward into the indefinite future and think that we can know exactly what's going to happen.